Well, friends, welcome. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whatever time it is for wherever you are and whatever time it is when you're actually watching this. Welcome to this Regent College bookstore event, which is a conversation with me, which is not the most important person that you want to talk to, but actually with Douglas Kane McKelvey about his recent publication, Every Moment Holy, Volume 2, about death, grief, and hope. And my name is Claire Perini, and I serve as the Associate Dean of Students here at Regent. And I am very, very excited about this conversation with Doug. So, Doug, welcome to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Claire.
We're so glad to have you. If you aren't familiar with Every Moment Holy, it may be because you and I haven't had a conversation in a while. Because I am a huge fan of Every Moment Holy. I've found them really helpful in my own spiritual life. And then here at Regent, in kind of our chapel gatherings and in some of our community life events, we've drawn on these liturgies for a whole bunch of different things. So Volume 1 has things, a liturgy for students and scholars, or for those flooded with too much information, for the keeping of bees, and I'll talk to Doug a bit more about that later. And then Volume 2, which focuses on death, grief, and hope, has liturgies like When News is Bad, or for returning to daily life after loss, for embracing joy and sorrow. And so the way this will work is that I'll ask Doug some questions and we'll have a conversation about the books. And then we'll take questions from you as well. So those of you who are listening, you can submit questions to questions@regent-college.edu, and I'll get those and we can kind of engage with those as well as we go through our time together. So let me give you a little bit of background about who Doug is, and then we'll dive in. So Douglas Kane McKelvey grew up in East Texas and then moved to Nashville to participate in the early work of Charlie Peacock's Art House Foundation, which is an organization dedicated to a shared exploration of faith and the arts. And then since then, he's worked as an author, a song lyricist, a writer, a script writer, and a video director. He's penned more than 350 lyrics, recorded by a variety of artists, including Switchfoot, Kenny Rogers, that's pretty cool, Sanctus Real, and Jason Gray. And for the last 4 years, Doug has served as the sexton at St. John's Anglican Church in Franklin, Tennessee. So Doug, welcome again. Thank you for being with us for this Regent Bookstore event.
I was so excited about this invitation when the possibility started to develop several months ago. So
yeah, we've been waiting for a long time. So the anticipation has been mounting. Why don't you begin by sort of just giving us a sense of how did these books come about? Sort of why did you write them? Why did you feel the urge to write them? And then did you expect people to love them as much as they do?
To answer the last part of the question first, no, I did not expect that, but we could get a little more into that later. They really came about accidentally. Initially, I was working on a novel. I was frustrated with my own inability to be very disciplined and to make good progress. I think I had gone through a couple-month period, probably in the winter, because I tend to struggle with, just being kind of down and melancholy, and struggle to move forward with what I'm working on during that time of the year anyway. And one morning I just thought I could really benefit from having a prayer that would focus me when I sit down to write, when I sit down to try to exercise a better stewardship of whatever gifts I've been given. So on a whim, I thought I'll try to write this prayer in a liturgical structure. So I wrote a liturgy for fiction writers, and I sent that to my friend Andrew Peterson, who there was a conference coming up that the Rabbit Room organization does every year, and Andrew and I were doing a session together along with author Heidi Johnston, and it had to do with story. So I just thought, oh, well, this might be an interesting way to close the the session. So I sent that to Andrew and asked him, hey, should we close the session with this? And he responded really quickly and said, I love this, but I wish I also had a liturgy for beekeeping, because that's one of his hobbies. And he listed a couple other things. And in that moment, it was like the vision for the whole book just was there all at once. And I just sat back and I thought, yeah, this isn't just a one-off novelty kind of thing. There's actually something here in this kind of form and paradigm for prayer about everyday things that could really serve the body of Christ. So I wrote a couple more of them that week, I think, and put together a pitch and took it to the managing editor at Rabbit Room Press, Pete Peterson, and pitched it to him over lunch, and he immediately said, yeah, we'll do it. But we're a small press and we don't have that kind of money to do a book like this the way we would want to. So you're going to have to give us some time to figure out how we could manage that. And that took about a year, and the involvement of community, mostly of the wider Rabbit Room community, just of people who saw some of the prayers or experienced a few of them that we used at one of the conferences. And it was not a crowdfunding paradigm where they were getting anything for it. They weren't even getting a copy of the book, but people were just coming up to us and saying, I want this to exist in the world. I want our community to be something that we can offer to the church and the world. And so that community just, stepped up to the table and funded the initial printing of the book. So it was very much a community effort, which really feels special.
Totally.
It wasn't a publishing company business driven kind of thing, even from the beginning. It was something that together we kind of had this vision that, we think this is something that should exist, and we want it to come from this community. So
kind of like a prayers of the people kind of thing.
Kind of,
there's that sort of buy-in from that. And can you talk to us a little bit about liturgies? So, here at Regent, we talk about theology for life, and I feel like every moment holy is, liturgies for life. But we don't always think about sort of liturgy and our day-to-day kind of life together. Do you want to talk to us about liturgies and how you understand just that word, maybe definition-wise?
Sure.
But then why is it helpful for these everyday sort of mundane aspects of life?
Well, the term that you just used, theology for life, I think something very close to that is at the heart of every moment holy, and what we're trying to do with that, because it's really about, I think for me, it was about beginning at this point of saying, okay, here are things that I absolutely believe to be theologically true from my understanding of Scripture, that God is sovereign over every facet of life, that he is present in every moment, that his Spirit is at work and desiring to use every moment and every circumstance in our lives to work in and through us, to draw us closer to him, to conform us more to the image of Christ, and to extend the work of his kingdom through us, individually and collectively. And so believing that, then writing these prayers was an exercise in looking at some of these moments, some that are special, but some that are just mundane moments of doing laundry or changing a diaper or doing home repairs, and saying, okay, if I believe from Scripture that God is present in this moment and would work in and through and around this task and in and through and around me as I engage in this, let's see if we can unpack that.
Right.
Can we build that bridge to go from just an abstract notion of God being at work in this moment to actually looking at some specifics of how might he be going about that? What grace might I avail myself of by, the posture of my heart being oriented to what is eternal that might break through even in this moment and this act, and that might illuminate that. So I think what you have that emphasis on at Regent is very much the same kind of thing, right? It's saying, let's not just leave all our theology in this abstract realm of truth claims, but let's begin to look at it and figure out how does that actually intersect our lives in a day-to-day way. How does that theological truth illuminate and how is it used to shape and change our hearts? And so but to back up to the larger question of liturgy and what is my understanding of liturgy, it is a term that gets used in a number of different ways, right? I mean, my understanding is that every church has liturgy, right? Because it just means the order and content of the worship services and the gatherings that we have together. So even if that order and content is an intentional lack of order and only spontaneous content, those choices still create a specific sort of liturgy of the way you do church. But then there's the broader understanding of liturgy that has to do with the rhythms and repeated practices of our lives that have transformative power, that have shaping power, either forming or deforming our hearts in relation to what is eternally true. So in that sense, there are good liturgies and there are destructive liturgies that we can engage in, those kinds of patterns that draw our hearts toward things that cannot satisfy ultimately, and that are not for our own good or for the good of those around us. So it was a choice to call these liturgies, but we did so because some of them are structured as a formal liturgy, where you have a part for a leader and then you have the parts for the people to respond. And others are more of geared as a prayer that an individual might pray. But the hope with all of them was that they might be prayers that could be incorporated into the rhythm of a person's life, of an individual, of a couple, of a family, of a small group at church, or of a church or organization. The hope was that most people who picked up the book could find several of the prayers that would naturally fit into what the content and rhythm and order of their lives already is,
right.
Such that the use of those could become a liturgical practice that could have a shaping power, that could, that could over time. Sometimes I think of it as laying the rails across across the landscape, so that when the train eventually comes through, you know, it will run on those rails rather than just, you know, going off into nothingness. So I think from the feedback that we've had over the last 3 years or so since the first book came out, that does seem to have happened in the way that we had hoped and prayed that it might, as we were working on the initial book. And you know, my secret hope as I wrote the first book, even though I wanted it to be broad enough that, you know, that people in many different stations of life would find it useful. But I just imagined the idea of a family with young children beginning to incorporate some of these liturgies into their lives, such that the children would grow up with their thinking about God and about eternity being shaped over years by some of these, and the possibility of some of the phrases then even becoming so familiar, and, you know, and working within their imaginations and their thoughts. And so it's been particularly exciting when I've received that kind of feedback of someone saying, hey, you know, anytime now that my toddler needs their diaper changed, they run and grab Every Moment Holy and bring it to me.
That's great. That's so great. That's sort of, and that whole idea of our kind of liturgies being the thing that kind of form our hearts kind of in the moment, but they also form our imaginations and our desires and the way that we think about things kind of when the moment comes. Maybe at the time that doesn't feel true, but when we're hit with something, then our memory and our imagination kind of goes back to that liturgy that we've been practicing and rehearsing, sort of thing, in our own lives. And so this kind of makes me wonder how you actually do this, right? So if you're familiar with Every Moment Holy, then you'll know that these have a particularly profound ability to articulate some of the real particularities of certain situations. So it makes me kind of wonder about the life that you've lived, Doug. Like, have you been, you know, a first responder and a beekeeper and, you know, an actor and a waiter? And are you the one who like stargazes as well as the one who feels awkward in social gatherings? Like, how do you get this insight into these sort of very particular experiences of life? Like, and what's the process for how you write them? Do you write them on your own? Do others help? You sort of alluded to that a little bit, maybe with the funding of it, but how other people, or how do you have that insight?
Some of them are drawn very much from my own experience. The one for those who feel awkward in a social gathering, definitely.
Is it?
The stargazing one as well. I mean, it's really this time of year when I start spending a lot of evenings out on my deck. In fact, I think tonight we're supposed to get a meteor shower. So
have you got your book ready to take with you outside?
The clouds clear off. It's somewhere around here.
Yeah.
But no, I've not been a first responder. I've never been a waiter. I did wash dishes in a restaurant kitchen. So I think what I've been able to draw from is I do have, well, as part of being awkward in social gatherings, I'm just generally awkward around people. I mean, I like people and I like to be around people, but at a certain point in life, probably somewhere in my 20s, I realized, okay, I don't pick up on social cues that other people seem to use to communicate a lot. And, I don't always know how to make small talk, and I'm not always entirely in touch with my emotions in the moment. I think there was, when I was in college, there was something that had happened that I felt, was aware of feeling nothing about at the time. Someone who I had been close friends with moved away, and probably 3 months later, I woke up in the middle of the night, almost in a panic, just overwhelmed by sadness about this. But from the time that it had happened, in those intervening 3 months, I had not been aware of any emotion related to it. But what I began to find, the more that I wrote fiction and poetry as well sometimes, was that when I was writing a character, that there was all this emotion down there that I could draw from, that I could really go inside the experience of the character through that process and live through it emotionally. And all of these things that I had felt about things in my own life, but not been connected to those feelings and emotions, would suddenly be connected all at once. And I was able to use that to create characters and emotional narratives that felt real. So I think at a certain point, I just had to make peace with that and say, okay, I know that somewhere inside me, I'm feeling things about what's going on right now, and eventually those are going to make it to the surface. But I just sort of have to be okay with waiting for that, because I can't force it. And I have this weird thing where in the moment, I'm not always completely connected with what's going on. So I think with writing some of those liturgies of things that I had not experienced, it was not a stretch to put myself inside the shoes of a waiter. And part of it too is just, that I've known people who are waiters. I've heard their stories,
right.
So it's like, I guess I'm always in gathering mode as a writer that way. And I don't know what I've gathered until I sit down to actually write about something. But then there have been a number of the liturgies, and especially with volume 2, where I just felt so utterly inadequate. And my great fear was that I was going to say the wrong things about some of those extremely difficult and heartrending experiences that I have not had. And so I intentionally, gathered, well, it wasn't all my doing. Some of it just seemed to be providential of the people who entered my life in one way or another during that season, but who were walking through those things. And I would write and I would send it to those people and say, what in here is articulating what's on your heart and is true to your experience, and what is not, what's hurtful, if there's anything in here that people might take the wrong way walking through that experience, and what am I completely clueless to that I could never imagine, until if and when I personally had to go through that experience. And so there were many voices. That was another community effort in that way, of people looking at what I was writing and helping to shape it until those prayers would reach a point where they would say, okay, now it's ready to go. I would not have, I don't think I would have written that book and released it apart from already having that kind of, collective voice of
Right.
the community of the grieving
Mm-hmm.
who were saying, yeah, this will serve people, this will help.
Right.
So,
Yeah. No, that's
you know,
really helpful because I was assuming and hoping that all those experiences, particularly in volume 2, were not experiences that you had because that there's no way that could be possible. So that makes sense, that kind of community effort. I wanted to ask a couple more questions, sort of more specifically
sure.
about volume 2, but just a reminder to those who are listening, if you've got questions that you'd love for Doug to answer, just email questions@regent-college.edu, and we'll try and to sort of field those questions as well. But yeah, definitely feel free to send those in.
I'm tempted to anonymously email in
yeah, what would
a question
you ask?
for myself.
Yeah, what would you? Yeah, but this is what I want to know. What would you ask if you were going to do an anonymous question? What would it be?
Probably something very obscure. That only I would know, and then I could act so surprised.
So it's questions, Doug. If you need an email, it's questions@regent-college.edu. If you need to email me a question, we can, that would be great. So you sort of alluded to this a little bit, but this whole volume on death, grief, and hope. Did you plan to do a whole volume on that? How did that sort of be the second volume? Why was that the decision for the second volume, and how did you come to that decision?
Gradually and incrementally. When I was finishing volume 1 the last few months, and volume 1 took roughly a year to write, I had a long list of potential topics that I hadn't written about yet. And I knew there was no way I could get to all of them by the deadline, and the book would have been probably at least twice as big as it was. So, the publisher wouldn't have been able to afford to publish it. But there were several that I was kind of keeping my eye on, thinking, that one feels pretty important, maybe I can get to it, or I would try to weed one out and then would have a conversation with a friend who would say, the prayer I most wish you would write would be blah, blah, blah. And I would be like, okay, well, that one's on my list. And I had already put it in the not going to get to it pile. But, if it's that important to people, then maybe it should be in there. There was one on the list for a liturgy for, it had a couple different potential titles, for the morning of a funeral, or the liturgy for those who grieve. But the idea was that it was a prayer for those who are in that immediate shell-shocked kind of aftermath of having just lost someone they love. And I just couldn't, in those last weeks, couldn't bring myself to start that one. It just felt like too much at the point. And it was an emotionally draining process of spending that year writing the book. And I think as I came toward the end of the process, I just didn't have enough left in me to approach that topic. So at the time that book was published, volume 1, I knew that the biggest gaping hole in it, from my perspective, was that there was no liturgy for those who grieve. So I think it was probably a year after volume 1 came out that I felt like I was in an emotional space where I could start working on liturgies again. And I wrote one, I think it's a liturgy for loving one man or woman well, which so far that one hasn't ended up in anything, maybe volume 3. But then I turned my attention to a liturgy for those who grieve. And I thought, it can go in volume 2, but in the meantime, it can go on the website as a free download. So it's, it's there if it would be helpful for people. I started working on that, got maybe a week and a half into it. It was 10 pages long. It was unwieldy, but I couldn't see any obvious section that I could cut because they all felt important. So I think I set it aside for a couple of days, came back to it and thought, well, that's probably because it's more than one prayer. You know, I can't cover this many topics in one. So I split it into maybe 6 prayers and continued to work on each of those. And they continued to fractalize and spin off into additional prayers. And then I thought, oh, well, I should probably write a prayer, a liturgy before mourning with those who mourn. You know, just kind of helping people who are about to go sit with someone bereaved, to prepare their hearts and minds to be in a place where they might truly be able to serve the person with their presence. So I started working on that one, and somewhere along about that time, I just realized, I think this is a book. You know, it's topically focused, so it's probably a third the length of volume 1. And so I pitched that idea to Rabbit Room Press, and they were like, yeah, you know, that would be great. Let's do that. So I continued working on those, and then I realized, well, what about prayers for a person who's dying? You know, every one of us in our pilgrimage, in our following of Christ, are called to walk through that valley of the shadow. So are there prayers that we could offer for, you know, the person who just got the diagnosis that they have 6 to 8 months to live? So I started writing prayers as well for someone who was dying, and it ended up, it just continued to expand, because the more I dug into it, the more prayers that I tried to write, the more facets of dying and grieving I became aware of. And a lot of that was because of people who were walking through these things that I was in conversation with, who would contact me and say, hey, have you written anything for this? Because, you know, this is what I'm going through this week, and I feel like I could really use a prayer about this. And so, you know, I was paying attention to all of those thoughts and suggestions, and you know, then would add those subjects to the list and work on those prayers as well. So eventually it turned into a 2-year writing process, and a book that I think is almost 80 pages longer than volume 1,
I was just
even though it's topically focused. So
I was going to say, you thought this is volume 1. That's how thick it is. This is volume 2. They look kind of the same, but it didn't end up being any smaller.
No.
And it sounds like, I mean, so 2020 has been obviously a year of loss and grief, and the church seems to have kind of recovered this, well, is recovering, I wouldn't say recovered, is recovering this need for lament. But it sounds like you were working on this pre-pandemic, pre-COVID, in your own thinking. Yeah.
I think maybe the last 7 months of that 2 years was after COVID had become a thing, and there were the lockdowns and all of that. I think that was maybe March of 2020, around then that started to happen. So but so I was already almost a year and a half into the writing process at that point. But there were at least a couple of prayers that I started in response to COVID that are in the book.
Which ones are those? Can you remember?
I think the first one was for a time of widespread suffering. And I might have to comb through
That's all right.
the table of contents
No worries.
to remember what the other one was.
No problem. No problem. And then the other thing that I think is so beautiful, particularly about volume 2, is this kind of theology of death that you sort of present in the foreword. And then this idea of death, that the theology of death that is rooted in eschatological hope. So can you tell us, how have you held kind of the presence of death and eschatological hope together, and how was that hard to do as you were writing, as you were trying to sort of be present in the moment of sort of articulating the very real presence of death, while also kind of the hope piece as well? Talk to us about how did you hold those together? Was that hard? What was that like?
It wasn't hard to do that. I mean, there were things about writing the book that were difficult, but that wasn't one of them. I think I was surprised at how impossible it seemed to get away from the idea of hope and talking about hope. I mean, there actually was a certain point where I was looking at a number of the prayers I had written and thinking, am I talking too much about hope? Because it's showing up so prominently in pretty much everything. But then I realized, no, that's the heart of it. That is where for the child of God, where the freedom to grieve and lament is, because death is not going to have the final word. You know, we can be honest with ourselves and with others about the grief and the sorrow that we are experiencing in this moment, and yet without becoming cynics or giving into despair, right? And it's because there is this hope that undergirds, and I think it wasn't just, that wasn't just an intellectual assent to a truth. It was as I dug into these difficult subject matters, and as I was in conversation with people who were walking through these things, it was their shining hope in the midst of loss and grief. You know, it was the way the eternal hope proved to be as hard as diamonds, and to be this foundation that they could stand on even as they wept and lamented. And in the same way, that it seemed that the further that I dug into these subjects, the more the hope just became undeniable beneath them. And I don't say that in a way where I would want to belittle anyone's experience of being in, you know, the worst throes of that very dark night of the soul, where they might be tempted to despair and might feel the anguish and wonder where God is. And but I think the hope comes from those things that we have walked through, and the witness of others who have walked through them, who say that's not the end. That's not where it ends. I can look back at the trauma in my own life and see that even in inexplicable ways that I can't mathematically work out, my faith is stronger, and my understanding that God is present with me and was even then is stronger. I mean, it somehow the grief, the experience of the grief, proved in a way that I can't even understand, that I can't articulate. It proved to my own heart the reality of God and his promises, and what the yearning and the longing that's planted in my own heart is leaning toward. So yeah, that aspect did not end up being hard. I mean, there was a gravity to it,
right?
You know, there was this settling gravity to spending 2 years considering these things, and to walking with people who were going through them. And you know, when I finished volume 1, all of the chaos and the pressure and everything, that just the way life didn't seem to work, and you know, it's still hard to believe that I got that book finished during that season. But as soon as I finished it, I mean, as soon as I hit the deadline and turned in the manuscript, everything just bounced back and life was good again. And neither side of that dynamic happened with volume 2. Life did not feel so utterly chaotic and like the wheels were coming off during those 2 years. But there was this gradually increasing, sobering sort of burden. And when I finished the book, that didn't lift. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, I think that's probably right and good. You know, it's not a depressive kind of thing, but I think it's that maybe I came a little closer to learning what it means to mourn with those who mourn, and to recognize that in the community I'm in, there are, you know, there's not just my grief that I carry, but there are people who have suffered devastating losses recently, who are carrying those. And you know, we're called to rejoice with those who rejoice, and to mourn with those who mourn, and those are to be real connections, not just surfacey kind of things. And so I think you know, there was some work happening, beginning in my own heart during that process in relation to those things.
Yeah, thanks for your honesty. It makes me wonder, you know, when you were saying you gave some of those prayers to people who've experienced things, you know, and this kind of hope and hope and kind of presence of death. When people responded back, did they say, "Oh, it's too hopeful," or did they say, "Actually, add more hope"? What was a combination? Like,
no one that I can recall. You know, there might have been one prayer that someone, an earlier draft of it, that they suggested that it spent too much time kind of describing the sense of just grief and lostness in the moment, and so I set to work trying to address that and to make the theme of hope stronger in that one. And then a week later, she contacted me again, and she said, "You know what? This was a really difficult week that threw me. I went back and read that one again, and it was perfectly articulating what I'm feeling, you know, now." And I actually encountered that kind of dynamic multiple times in my conversations with people, which not specifically about hope, but just someone initially having a potentially negative response to part of the prayer, who then would come back, you know, a week or two later and say something like that, or say, you know, actually what happened was it had triggered some things. It had reopened some things I had never dealt with. And that's why I responded pretty defensively the way I did. But I went to, you know, to pastoral counseling, and we kind of talked through this and worked through this. And And thank you for, for writing those things. So part of what that illuminated for me was just that grief is a process and a journey, and it's no two people will grieve in the same way or at the same pace or will need exactly the same things to feel supported as they're moving through that process. And we all have those tender spots that that if that thing that we're carrying is named, maybe it's named for us for the first time,
right?
Where we've been carrying it without really realizing it, so one of my prayers for this book is that as I said earlier, there was an aspect of fear and trembling to writing it, because from the outset I was looking at some of these subjects and saying, I don't have any business writing this. I don't have any business trying to articulate what's on the heart of a person who has lost a child. My wife and I have gone through a couple of miscarriages, but we've never had a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old, that we've had to grieve the loss of. And I have friends who have had those experiences, and it felt very presumptuous to think, oh, I can write something that will articulate for them what's on their hearts and that will be helpful for them as they grieve and move through the process. But I also couldn't get away from the sense that this book was something that I needed to write and to invest the time in. And so, and I think that was good. I think that, I shudder to think of what the book might be if I had not been forced into the arms of community, to co-labor with me on shaping these things.
Yeah, that's so helpful. We've got a question here from someone that they've sent in, and it's sort of just a question about sort of liturgy more generally. So for Christians who might be from something that we might call a more sort of non-liturgical sort of tradition, where they haven't had that as part of their formation, or maybe they're even a bit sort of opposed to sort of liturgy with what we're talking about, how would you speak to them, or how would you sort of either enrich or sort of provoke them to sort of think about liturgy? For someone who might be thinking that maybe there's a lack of the Holy Spirit in the way that, the lack of the spontaneity of the Spirit in our prayers. Can you talk to us about what would the response to that be?
Sure. First, I would say that would have been me as a teenager.
Right.
And probably at some point into my early 20s. I came from backgrounds where I would have been very suspicious of anything like that. For me, I think the first little seed of change in relation to that was during my college experience. I reached a point where I didn't know what was true. I still believed that God existed, and I believed that Jesus was his son, but beyond that, I just didn't know. And I didn't have any coherent scriptural theological framework at that point in my life. But I was in a place where there were a lot of wacky theological ideas, and I could recognize this stuff is just wrong, but I don't know what's right. I don't know what to replace it with. And one Sunday, a friend invited me to go to church with him, and it was to a church that used the Book of Common Prayer. I'd never heard of that before. And I didn't end up going to that church, but things that I heard the one or two Sundays that I went there stuck in my mind, things that I read from the Book of Common Prayer, like in the prayer of repentance, when we ask God's forgiveness for things we have done and left undone.
Right.
That phrase, things we have done and left undone, stuck in my head, and it actually over a period of years worked to shape my theology.
Right.
Because I chewed on that idea that, oh, sin isn't just about things I do, but the things I should and I don't.
Yeah.
And there was also a poetry, a poetic sensibility to a lot of the phrasings of the prayers in the Book of Common Prayer, and that was something that I immediately seized on as well.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until about around a decade ago that I started going to a church that was more liturgical in that kind of sense. So most of my life, I was not in that vein in terms of expressions of worship. But I think some of the things that I look at, if I consider the question of what would I tell my 16-year-old self?
Yeah.
Right? I would say, your suspicion is that something that's pre-written cannot, that the Holy Spirit cannot move through it, right? That it needs to be this just spontaneous outpouring of the heart. And yes, we do need that kind of dialogue with our Creator. But I would say, what do you think of the Lord's Prayer?
Right.
When Jesus' followers asked him, teach us how to pray, he gave them this prayer that then, from that point on, is a pre-composed prayer.
Right.
What will you make of that? What about worship songs? You've never questioned that these worship songs that you sing in church and that you join your heart to, and that give expression to the longings of your own soul to worship your Creator. You don't seem to have the same question about those having been pre-written. Do you not think you should instead be going to a church where all songs are spontaneous in the moment?
Right. Making a joyful noise, kind of idea. Yeah.
Right. So the idea being that there are already forms that, without thinking about, that we accept and embrace the notion that the Holy Spirit can be at work through these things. And once I moved more into adulthood and was working at the Art House Foundation that you mentioned in your introduction, where we're looking at this intersection of art and faith and how these things are integrated. I think my understanding of the way the Spirit of God would work through the talents that each of us have been given to steward. And I find typically my greatest wrestlings with God are when I'm trying to write these prayers and I'm on my knees begging that he would meet me in the process, because I know that I don't have it in me. I do not have the wisdom. I just I don't have anything to give his church. If it is not his good pleasure to take these, puny, shriveled little fishes and few dried loaves, which in my experience is basically me just being willing to show up. That's all I can do. I can show up and sit down and say, okay, I'm here. If you want to show up and somehow make the whole more than the sum of the parts that I can bring to it.
Right.
And if you would serve your people through this, then please do so, because I can't. I recognize my own poverty and lack in that regard. But then experiencing communion with God in the process of the craft of laboring over, of wrestling over these expressions, and doing so in the expectation that it might provide comfort, it might provide guidance, it might give words to someone to cry out to God in the midst of an experience that, as they're walking through it, they don't have the objective distance to think about it and formulate the words. And that's one of the main comments, repeated comments from various people that we've had since the book has been published, is it gives me words to pray in the moments when I have no words.
Yeah. And there's that sense too where the Spirit's infusing of your words, it's not bound to time. The Spirit's work is not bound to time, right? So if the Spirit's at work as you're wrestling and on your knees, and then 2 years later someone is praying that prayer, might the Spirit's infusing presence in that prayer still be infused in the presence of that moment of that person praying it? That sort of our understanding of the Spirit's work throughout time, and not sort of in a time bound, like right now as I'm, right now, but actually over time and in time. And it makes me wonder that. Our time is almost gone, but I've, sorry, were you going to say something else?
I think I lost the thought.
Already, sorry. Okay. Well, if it comes back, feel free to let. Our time is almost gone, but I thought, is there one kind of final question that it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on? Is there one sort of liturgy that you're kind of desperate to write, and you just you wish you've written it, but you haven't written it yet, but you're thinking about writing it? And then what's next for Every Moment Holy? Is there a volume 3? What are you thinking? But is there a liturgy you're kind of desperate to write and might make it into another volume? What's next?
I don't know that there's just one in particular. I was recently looking through that long list of potential topics, just to see what was there. And there were several that jumped out at me. One of them that I thought, I really want to write that, was a liturgy for mechanics or those who work with machines. Which, I'm not much of a mechanic, other than I can change the oil on my car. But I think it's just the idea of that exercise of diving into that, because it's very different. And there's something really interesting about the prayers that are vocationally focused.
Right.
One for medical providers, for first responders, for waiters and waitresses, for those who work in wood and stone and metal and clay. And so there's something really intriguing about this idea of exploring the intersection of the kingdom of God and laboring to repair machines, right?
Right.
And I don't know what that will unpack. I don't know what it will look like, but it's just, there's something intriguing about that.
Little spark there.
I don't, as to what comes next for Every Moment Holy, I suspect it will be another topically focused volume, probably before I get to another wide cross section kind of
Yeah.
volume, like volume 1 was. But I don't know what that will be yet. There are 4, maybe 5 ideas that I have written some things for already, that I expect, if I live long enough, that eventually we'll get to these.
Yeah.
I mean, one of them is, it was interesting when we started asking people, what would you like to have prayers for? There were several of the hundreds of ideas that were submitted that fell into this category of someone who on release day from prison, or some other things related to incarceration, or to addiction, to relapsing, to entering a rehab program. And that gave me pause, because it just wasn't something I expected,
Right.
that we're going to get a grouping in this category. At this point, I think that if I start to work on something in relation to that it will be one that's more topically focused,
Yeah.
and maybe a third the length.
Yeah.
But I've thought that before.
Right. So you don't really know.
Right. So that's one. There's another one that I have written several for, is related to the season of life of dating, falling in love, early years of marriage, having kids, some of the celebratory things, the struggles, and one that would include, it would include liturgy for the birth of a child, but also one for those struggling with infertility, and just covering that whole range of that part of life. Again, one that I initially thought, I think this would be a shorter volume, and maybe it would, but I do probably have a dozen written for that one already, so that's a likely candidate for the next book. I'd
love you to write one on friendship. Not that you're not taking suggestions from me, but that's another one.
No,
Add that to your list.
actually, we take suggestions from anyone. And Rabbit Room Press has created a Google Doc where when people submit, ideas, they're just plugging them in there so I can look at them.
Good.
So we're very open to suggestions from the community.
Wonderful.
But it would be good to. I mean, there are probably several that could be written about friendship, right?
Yeah, totally. You might need a whole volume.
More specific about various aspects of it.
No, thanks, Doug. It's been so lovely to talk with you, and I've so appreciated kind of getting in your brain about how do these prayers actually come about. So thank you for your time, and thanks for your presence with us, and for kind of gifting the Christian community with your beautiful words and just your depth of kind of engagement with these every moments and seeing God's presence in that. We're so grateful for your time. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Claire.
We're so glad. So friends, here are the 2 books, Every Moment Holy, Volume 1 and Volume 2, and both are available at the Regent College bookstore for $49.99. So you can either buy that in store, or you can, for a mail order, you can call or email, and they'd be happy to ship it off to you. Regent College bookstore is a non-for-profit whole entity that is wholly owned by Regent College, and so all the proceeds go directly to support the ongoing ministry of Regent College. So if you're going to buy a book, that would be a great place to buy it. If you're in the States, you might be buying it from somewhere else, but if you're in Canada, that would be a wonderful place for you to support. And then just one more kind of note to say some things that are coming up at Regent. Beginning next week, our Regent summer programs begin with 1-week courses, sort of from now until the end of July. And there's a new course almost every week. And so if you register by this Friday, May 7th, you'll avoid a late fee. So save those pennies and you can register now. Let me give you a bit of a whet your appetite on some of the things that sort of relating to some of the things that Doug was talking about, but that might kind of interest you. So there's a class on spiritual disciplines in the company of others with Susan Phillips. Teach Us to Pray, Jesus, the Father and Prayer in the Spirit with Wesley Hill. Loving to Know, a workshop in covenant epistemology with Esther Meek. Why Beauty Matters, Aesthetics and the Church with David Taylor. And 5 Traditions and Practices of Prayer with Bruce Hindmarsh. That's just a very small collection of courses, but I would encourage you to go to the Regent website and to check out our summer programs. We would love to have you in class with us over this summer that are happening. They'll all be accessible online as well. So we'd love to see you and have engaged with you in class as well. So Doug, thank you once again for your time. Thanks for your presence in our conversation. Friends, thanks for joining us. Until next time.